My name's Rebecca Taylor from Cambridge University Press, and I'm very pleased to welcome Claire Cramch and Jiwa to this online event to celebrate the imminent publication of Claire's book, Language's Symbolic Power. Claire Cramch is Professor Emerita at the University of California, Berkeley. She's published extensively in the field of applied linguistics and has won the Kevin Mildenberger Award from the Modern Language Association on 3 occasions. She is the past president of the American Association for Applied Linguistics and of the International Association of Applied Linguistics. Conversing with Claire today will be Jiwa, who is Professor of Educational Linguistics at the University of Birmingham. Together with Claire Cramch, she is co-editor of the Cambridge University Press series, Key Topics in Applied Linguistics, in which Language's Symbolic Power will publish shortly. So over to you, Jiwa, for your first question.
Well, thank you very much, Becky and Rachel and the team at Cambridge University Press. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to have an opportunity to talk with Claire, given we haven't seen each other for such a long time, and also congratulate to Claire on the publication of your wonderful book, Language as Symbolic Power. So maybe I could start with a question about the topic. So the title, Language as Symbolic Power, is a metaphor. So why this topic? What motivated you to choose this topic?
Well, thank you first, Jiwa, for agreeing to converse with me on my new book, and thank you to Rachel and Rebecca for organizing this wonderful conversation. Of course, regarding this particular book was born out of a course, an undergraduate course that I gave for some 15 to 20 years, in fact, at UC Berkeley. First through my department, the German department at Berkeley, then through the College of Language and Letters and Science, that appealed to a broad range of students from all over campus. The success of that course and the impetus that it gave me to think about these issues of language and symbolic power was instrumental in my believing that it would be a good idea to put that in the form of a book. It is not a textbook, but it is basically a distillation of the ideas of both my students in that course and my own ideas over many years. Besides the direct impetus for this book from this course that I gave, of course, I look at symbolic power in language and as language from my own background, growing up in a family where my father spoke a different language than my mother. My mother was British, my father was French, and growing up in that environment in Versailles in the 40s and 50s, gave me a sense that language was much more than just a code or a way of talking. It was a way of participating in family dynamics where the use of one language or the other meant much more than what was said. If my mother addressed me in French, she was using the language of my father. If my father did not address us in English, that's because he did not belong to the world of my mother. So the two worlds were really very different and sometimes incompatible. When I came to the US, I was again confronted with issues of language, language associated with values and with power plays that I didn't quite understand. And so my immigration to the US, my multilingual background were influential in my thinking of giving this course at UC Berkeley and then writing the book.
Thank you, Claire. I can see I was one of very few people who actually very fortunate to have the opportunity to read your book. I can see many connections at from, at a personal level, also professional level, that actually filter through in the book. And the book is beautifully written. We have an endorsement from Alistair Pennycook and Tim McNamara, who actually written our first book for our series, Key Topics, Language Subjectivity. He actually said in his endorsement, the book is a tour de force, the fruit of your brilliant command of ideas and arguments from many fields and many languages and cultures. It's powerfully and clearly argued and a pleasure to read. I couldn't agree with him more on this. So how did you put the books together, and how did you find the writing process?
Well, the organization of the book came, whenever I write a book, it comes out of a sense of frustration, I would even say sometimes indignation, that my field, which is language teaching, is looking at language in ways that I feel there's always something missing. And what was something missing was the subjective, and the power dimension of language that I had experienced. So my readings in applied linguistics and in other fields showed me that there's much more in language than just encoding and decoding, which my colleagues in language teaching seem to be content with. I knew from my experience and from my readings that there was more to language than that. So I knew I wanted to make the argument, both for my students in the course that I was talking about and my colleague language teachers and applied linguists, that there's so much more to language use that has to do precisely with the notion of symbolic power. And that's the argument I want to make in the book. So how do I go about making a book out of this? Well, first I open a file. That's always my first thing. I open a file in my computer, and everything that I read over 1 or 2 years or even 3 years, a newspaper clipping, a conversation I had with somebody, a reading that I have done, I put it in the file. And slowly the file gets bigger and bigger, and I have to think of chapters, how to divide up the material. My other occupation as the book is maturing in my mind is to establish a bibliography. That's one of the first things that I do. Everything that I read, how does that relate to the argument that I want to make in that book? And you carry that with you on Sundays and weekdays and holidays, and you think about it all the time. And as you start writing then, and the introduction comes always at the end, as you start writing, the words have a way of growing on you and making you think of things that you hadn't thought before. And so the problem becomes not sort of going out of bounds, because there's so much you could say about this topic, and so many examples of everyday life, and we will be talking about why I have so many examples from Donald Trump in the book, is because the political situation lends itself to this kind of topic. So now and then I always have to go back to what am I trying to say, not losing track over the many chapters of the final argument that you want to make. And then you have to balance the need for repetition and the need for innovation. And then I open another folder, which is called Remnants. And in that, as I sort of cut up and paste, almost like making a sculpture, I tend to then put all the things that I have to cut out, but I don't want to lose, I put them in the remnants folder. And that's how basically I operate writing this book.
Sounds wonderful. It starts from files. I love the idea of files, words, stories, and you piece it together. I'm also curious about you actually mentioned you got frustrated by the political environment. How did you manage staying positive or manage your anger while you're writing the book? And I remember there were days when you were writing the book, I don't really hear from you. And you sometimes emerge from the email, said, okay, I've been writing on this. So how did you actually manage the emotional side of creation? This is a creativity, and the writing is really about creating new ideas. How did you manage emotions during your creative process?
Yes. Well, my way of dealing with emotions or strong emotions, let's say anger or disappointment, excuse me, has always been to find the larger picture, to embed what makes me angry or what makes me sad or what makes me happy in the larger picture that explains why I am feeling all these emotions, and to understand myself in my historical biography. Why am I so incensed or angered when my colleagues are not? And what is it in my biography that makes me so feel so strongly about these things? So it's a process of historicization and contextualization that helps me deal with that. And in fact, understanding the historical context of why I feel so strongly about certain issues is helped by writing about it and finding the words, the proper words, the precise words to capture that anger.
Thank you. So tell us very briefly, what is symbolic power? What is the thing you're trying to put across through this wonderful book?
Well, I'm trying to counter the idea that language is only a code that you plug in and that gets decoded at the other end. So I've been very much, as we will discuss surely, influenced by Bourdieu and his idea of symbolic power. And in my own words, I consider symbolic power as the power to use symbols. Now, symbols are words, but also pictures, clothes, images, food, behaviors. These are all things that have more meaning than just the material substance out of which they are made. So symbolic power would be this power to use symbols not only to denote things in the real world, and to connote status and authority, but to change people's perceptions and evaluations of that reality. So it is not a psychological concept, it's a social concept, social symbolic, as a way of influencing or having an action on your environment through these symbols. Symbolic power is, of course, and that is something that my students always had difficulty really grasping. Symbolic power can only operate with the complicity of the people involved, of the people on whom it is exercised, because the people have to recognize the value of a symbol in order to react to it or to be influenced by it or to be changed by it. So it is a power that you can that you do have in your mother tongue, and when you learn a foreign language, you learn to exercise that power in the foreign language and influence then the context in which you operate.
This actually connect really well with a couple of questions in the chat box. It's really to do with the language, to do with the lack of language proficiency. So if I can read out these questions. So these questions about language proficiency, the question is, does the lack of language proficiency, more specifically vocabulary, dictions, affect the power in any way? And related question is whether you have looked into the ESL, English Second Language Learners, in your studies book. I guess these both questions is really about language. What is exactly that actually influence power, and whether the power mentioned in the questions is the same as you have defined in the symbolic power.
That's one of the things indeed that I have needed to clarify right from the beginning in the book, is that when we learn a language, whether it's ESL or another foreign language, we're not just learning words like labels on the furniture of the universe, as somebody said. We're not just learning a code, we are learning categories of thinking. And that's where readings in cognitive science have helped me a great deal. So, for instance, Dan Slobin or George Lakoff show that when we speak, we use categories, mental categories, that are categories in the mind, through which we apprehend reality. Just to give an example that I sometimes give that I think I give in the book, is, for instance, if you have the choice of talking about the protests that are going on in various American cities, you can call them protests, or you can call them demonstrations, or you can call them riots, or you can call them terrorist acts. The word that you choose will be, in fact, indicative of a context that will be filled with ideology and with values. And so whether you use, for instance, with somebody, whether you say tu or vous in French, for instance, or tú and usted in Spanish, is not just a label, formal or informal, as very many textbooks describe it, but in fact, you are using a category of social relations that indicate either solidarity or power or both. And that is why it becomes a little more complicated or complex, because the words that you choose index complex social relations in which you play a powerful part.
So that's actually the intriguing, I found that's actually intriguing part of symbolic power. So let's dig a bit deeper into this concept of symbolic power. I think your work has strong connections with philosophy, sociology, cultural studies, anthropology, social linguistics, and applied linguistics. One of the key philosophers whose work you have drawn is Bourdieu. You mentioned just now, actually. So in fact, the title of the book, it mirrors his main influential book, Language and Symbolic Power. So in what way does your conceptualization of symbolic power build on his work or differ from his work? I think that will help us to understand what exactly symbolic power in your conceptualization.
Yes, I build very much on the work of Bourdieu. In fact, my relationship to Bourdieu, I met him once when he came to Berkeley, and I did not know him when he was my contemporary, when I did all my studies at the Sorbonne in Paris. I met him in the US when he came to Berkeley. But in 1982, when he wrote his famous book, Ce que parler veut dire, what it means to talk, and he took a sociological approach to language and language use, a colleague, when I was teaching at MIT at the time, put that book on my desk and said, if you want to know what the French are talking about in Paris right now, here's the book. And when I read that book, I was absolutely overbolden. Bourdieu was describing precisely the kind of experience that I had had in the French educational system, the institutional constraints and opportunities that the French educational system gives. But I was feeling at the time a little, how could I say, new coming to the US. I was a little unsettled. And I remembered my feeling of not quite fitting into the French educational system because I was bilingual and my mother was not French. And at the time, having a mother who was not French I perceived, and it was perceived as a handicap to be bilingual and not monolingual. And Bourdieu expressed precisely what I was living through, what I had been living through, because he too came from the southern part of France and was stigmatized for not being Parisian and not belonging to the upper middle class Parisian bourgeoisie that I also felt estranged from. And so that book, and later all the things that Bourdieu wrote about symbolic power, resonated very much with me. They explained to me why I was feeling not belonging or rejected by the French school system. What I gained from Bourdieu was a sociological understanding of these symbolic processes in language and or as symbolic power that I needed to make my students, my American students in the US, conscious of, because everything that you tell about language and language use to an American student gets interpreted immediately through a psychoanalytic lens. So when I talk about symbolic violence, oh, they say, that's the same thing as microaggression. And I say, no, it's not. And I have to encourage them to think about these struggles and these power struggles in sociological terms and not only in individualistic psychoanalytic terms. Of course, being in the US, I got to notice that Bourdieu was a little strict on the influence of institutions on your power to use language. And that's because he is French and because French institutions are much more, how could I say, give you a perception of permanence and stability that American institutions don't because of the different political system here. And so I've had to supplement Bourdieu with Butler and Bakhtin for my students to bring in a little bit of individual agency into the picture. And that's what people who will read my book will find in the book.
That's actually so interesting. It seemed to be a good time to actually mention the question in the chat. It's from somebody who actually clearly knows your work. So this is a question about how symbolic power complements your concept of symbolic competence. You talk about conversation, interaction, and yes. Power seems to be more violent framing of social interactions. Bourdieu used it to denote dominance. Does it have to be? So two questions in one. How does it actually complement your previous concept of symbolic competence? And second one, does it have to be dark?
I didn't quite understand the last comment.
Second one, yeah. So the power or violence seem to be a violent sort of a negative framing of social interaction. In Bourdieu's framework, he used it to denote dominance.
Yes.
Does it have to be?
Yes. So two questions. First, the questions of how writing this book supplements my notion of symbolic competence. Yes. My notion of symbolic competence, one can disagree or agree with the notion of competence, and it has brought me into trouble, in fact. I was building, I intended to supplement the notion of communicative competence by a focus on the symbolic power that language provides. But I have been very often misunderstood in the notion of symbolic competence, that it is just another competence like grammatical competence or sociolinguistic competence, when for me, the notion of symbolic competence was always linked to an understanding of the power, the symbolic power included in language use. And so the writing of this book is an opportunity for me to show almost how I came to the notion of symbolic competence through the notion of symbolic power. It is the power to reframe the context and to be aware of the symbolic power of the interlocutors in the presence of one another. So in that sense, the book supplements the notion of symbolic competence by putting it into a clearly and explicitly post-structuralist context that I spend a lot of the introduction explaining. So I think people who have been intrigued by this notion of symbolic competence will find in the book a larger framework in which to embed the notion of symbolic competence. Your second question was, and I've forgotten already.
Yes, what. It's really about do we have to use a term like a violence to describe dominance?
Yes, yes, yes. The notion of symbolic violence that Bourdieu sometimes makes the equivalent of symbolic power has given me trouble in Anglo-Saxon countries, I must say. People say, why do you use the word violence? Why not coercion or manipulation? Symbolic violence sounds so violent. Bourdieu uses the word violence in French, which is equally violent, a violent word in French, but it has the advantage of moving into the social framework of his thinking and out of the psychoanalytic individual, if you wish, to denote a concept or to refer to a concept that is both physical and mental. So doing violence to someone is suggesting or persuading or convincing someone to do something that is already, according to Bourdieu, doing violence to that person. So it can be as non-violent as, for instance, going into a classroom and listening to a teacher. The teacher, in fact, is doing violence to your brain, to your identity, to yourself, because the teacher is opening your mind to other ideas, and as such is doing violence onto you. So this is a beneficial, one could say, form of violence. But Donald Trump, when he lies through his teeth and whips up racist rage against the Democrats or the liberal elite, is doing another kind of violence, equally psychological and physical in the sense that it applies to your emotions and your rage, but at the same time it borders on the physical because it elicits physical reactions of anger and then can lead, of course, to armed physical harm.
Thank you. That's actually, yeah, that's a very good point to actually to look into the examples. And one of the strengths of this book is the rich, current, and engaging examples you use in making argument. And I found the stories from children's book are particularly endearing. And of course, and also those the examples from social media. You talk about meme, Facebook, Instagram, Twitters, and everyday communication. So when writing about symbolic violence can turn into symbolic warfare, you use Donald Trump's Twitter as example. So how does this political situation in the United States impact the way you view the issues discussed in this book? And it's also related to several questions pop up in the chat. It's really about the overall political situation, for example, populism. How does actually this political situation influence the way you see symbolic power and the role of language symbolic power in understanding these political situations?
Right. Well, that is a very important question. It was, as I was writing the book, political events in the world, and in particular in the United States, changed. I started teaching the course on which the book is based in the early 2000s. And now, since 2016, the topic of the book has become eminently of political relevance. And it has led me to think that the teaching of language is not an innocent endeavor, that any kind of language teaching is a political activity. And I'm not the only one to have said that. And when I mean political, I don't mean party politics. I mean the teaching of police and political always involves power and the exchange of power or the perception of power. And in that regard, it is indeed a political activity. The advent of Trump in the White House, of course, has given not only me, but many people who are writing about it right now, enormous fodder and fruit for thought. There are many books that are coming out with the word political associated with language. There's a book coming out on the politics of language, or language in the Trump era has just come out with Cambridge University Press, or the political issues linked with the algorithms of social media, Google, Facebook, etc., are all political issues that intersect with what I talk about in the book. My problem has been not to have the whole book colonized by Donald Trump, because Donald Trump has so many examples of the abuse of language and the use of language, as David Brooks says, for political warfare or social warfare. That you could have had, I could have filled the book with examples from Donald Trump. But the silver lining of the abuses of language by Donald Trump has been to put these, all this issue of symbolic power on the front burner, and shows the weight and the power of language to affect people's perception of reality in particular, since he is constantly constructing an alternate reality in his rallies and his speeches that are going to, in a few days, going to affect the elections in the US. So yes, politics is very much in the background of that book.
Well, so we have lots of challenge these days facing us politically and also everyday life. So how do we engage with symbolic power, and how do we respond to symbolic violence? I think there are a couple of questions in the chat box asking how do we actually use language as symbolic power to show resilience and challenge symbolic violence.
Yes. Well, this is something, of course, that I have thought all through the book. And I do tackle that question at the end. And I've had to tackle it with, of course, with the courses that I have given on the topic. One of the main things is to understand the workings of symbolic power. And that is the purpose of this book, is to explain, to show, to illustrate how language in fact manipulates social and symbolic power through its influence on our perception of reality, which is the definition of symbolic power, how it manipulates our sense of what is good, what is worth living for, and our sense of what is real and what is true. And it does this through strategies of face saving, for instance, or categorizations in the mind, or strategies of power and solidarity through the use of pronouns. Language in its grammatical and syntactic forms, through its speech acts, all has to do with how power is managed among people. So the first thing to counteract symbolic violence is to understand how it works. And I give examples between Trump and Nancy Pelosi, for instance, or Chuck Schumer. That's the first thing, to understand how it operates. The second thing is to understand the larger historical context. How come one person or another is interrupting you all the time, or is choosing to spin your words in a way that you hadn't intended at all? That is to put the bullying that happens in everyday life, or the manipulation of language around the dinner table, in the larger context of the different participants in what I call the power game. So that's the second step, the historicization, and to be quite aware of the hurt or the injuries that you experience as you listen to that language. The third step is for you to decide then how to engage the other. Are you going to argue with the person? Are you going to check the facts of the person? And we have to deal with that every day now with Donald Trump. Are we going to take what he says at face value? Are we going to check his facts? Are we going to argue with people who support Trump? And there are very many people who said, you don't argue with a bully. You don't argue with a Trump supporter, because none of the facts that you're going to give him or her are going to change their minds. So what do? You have to protect yourself, and you have to know when to disengage, or when to switch the topic, or when to avoid the contact for a time being, or to talk, to show, to realize, for instance, that the reason why the person is switching the topic is because they don't want to talk about another topic that is too hurtful or too painful for them. And so you decide which behavior to adopt at the moment that is appropriate.
So your comments actually had made lots of listeners to think about two questions. The first one is really the meaning, the social meaning of the science. So not just the language itself, but also science, symbolic meanings, and different kinds of science, semiotics that we're actually engaged. So would you like to comment on those a bit more? So in terms of how what we mean by language has evolved in the last few years due to the works on multimodality, materiality, and how these sort of enlarged, expanded social meaning of science have actually influenced your view on language as symbolic power.
Yes, well, that's where I thought that the communicative language teaching has gone short. Communicative language teaching has brought us to understand that communication is the expression, as Breen and Candlin said already in 1980, the expression, interpretation, and negotiation of meaning. And the movement called multiliteracies and the multimodalities movement, etc., are all very keen on pointing to the construction of meaning and how we should encourage students to make their own meanings, etc. But they don't, what I can't find in the communicative approach is the notion that making meaning is a risky proposition because you go against the meanings made by others. Meaning is at stake in the power struggle, in the symbolic power struggle that language represents. People fight over meaning. Right now in America, people are fighting one another over the meaning of what America represents in the world. What is America? What is the mission of the value of America? And the meaning of the narrative of America is exactly what people are fighting over. And so my notion of symbolic competence is an awareness that meaning is not innocent. Creating meaning sometimes goes against the meaning that other people will attribute to events, people, or things. And so we've got to factor in that controversial element. And right now at Berkeley, we have a little group of language teachers who have gotten together and decided that in their classes, they are going to teach the conflicts. Teaching the conflicts, for instance, in a class, in a Hebrew class, means teaching what the Hebrew speakers are interested in talking about. Or, for instance, in German, teaching the controversies around the Holocaust, or teaching the controversies around freedom of speech in France. And what does that mean for the French? And why are the French so differently interested in freedom of speech than the Americans based on their historic background?
That's wonderful, Claire. I think the second question the listener have is really so going back to another areas of your expertise, culture. We are curious, including myself, how actually do you see, you have actually published extensively on language and culture. So how language as symbolic power influence your view about the relationship between language and culture?
Yes, thank you for that question. Of course, everything we've just talked about is about culture, because culture is nothing but language as discourse, culture as discourse. If you look at Skolin and Skolin, the book on intercultural communication, it's a discourse approach. So if you take language as a discourse, as the exchange of meaning between people, culture is the meaning that you give to the values of a country, of an individual, of a group, of a collectivity. And so culture is something that people fight about. And in fact, in America right now, through Donald Trump, we have that expression of cancel culture. It's the people who want to bring down the monuments to the warriors and the generals in the Civil War, those who were for slavery and those who were against slavery. And the people who are tearing down the statues of General Lee, for instance, in Georgia and North Carolina, are accused of canceling culture. Culture has to do with history, and the history of not just facts as dates and the names of battles, but how the history of certain values, that we hold dear and that we stand for and die for through wars and things like that.
That's actually really, really interesting. And I think this is actually going back to this book, Language as Symbolic Power. I think you have made a great case to that symbolic power can turn into, is something we all have, and it can turn into symbolic violence and warfare. So it is, in a way, it's a dark warning to all of us in this challenging time. And reading your book, I'm also looking for message of hope, and I found plenty in the acknowledgement you mentioned. As the book goes to print, the COVID-19 pandemic is raging across the globe, revealing long-standing inequalities, injustices. But it has also revealed extraordinarily powerful forces for social justice led by a new generation of young people who are both socially aware and politically savvy. I hope the book can contribute to this new awareness in the years to come. So what does this mean for us, researchers, educators in applied linguistics, for many of us who actually join in and listen to your comments? What do you think we should do as applied linguists can contribute to the discussion and debates on social justice and equality?
Yes, well, if there's a silver lining to the language wars, I could say, because that's really what we're facing in the US in the last 4 years. It has been linguistic and discursive warfare that we've been subjected to, abuses of language. That the silver lining in those things is that it has absolutely sensitize people to the importance of language and the importance of the complexity of truth, because facilitated and helped by social media and by Google and Facebook and all this digital technology, the notion of truth has come to the fore and been the object of controversy. Words like alternate realities, post-truths, and all these things have made us pretty desperate to know who to believe, who to trust, whether you can trust what anybody says, in particular what the politicians say. It has become pretty dire. But it has rallied a large segment of the young population, precisely. The Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd demonstration after the death of George Floyd and other people of African Americans who were killed through brutal police action, and a lot of indignation throughout the nation as to the politics of populism and almost linguistic terrorism that Donald Trump has subjected us to, have made us not only all more aware, but have responded in kind. And although the stakes are high, as we saw yesterday with the nomination of a new Supreme Court justice that is going to stay in the court for the rest of her life, there is a possibility that the tide has reached its lowest ebb, and that the tide is turning. So we all hope that the political climate will become more congenial, and that Americans can find again the trust to one another that were in previous times. For educators, I think the message is find a way of being political without being party politics in your classes. I think the the profession of language teaching has never been more necessary than today. But our role has to go beyond just teaching vocabulary, syntax, and grammar. It has to be to teach the value of words, the symbolic value of words, the way, for instance, power is exercised in turns at talk, in group work or pair work. It has to, teachers have to place text in their historical context to show how and why people would say things one way or not another way. And so the current events in the political area are, I think, sensitizing teachers to their educational, that means their political role, by opening students' eyes to language as symbolic power.
That's great ideas. I really like the idea of educators actually really need to teach beyond linguistic code, going behind the code, understand the symbolic meaning and social cultural context of who said what to whom. That's a really important message. I think that's we had a really good discussion. Maybe we could actually bring up one question actually asked by the audience earlier. And I think because there are so many questions in the chat box, I just couldn't actually listen, do multitask as fast as I could manage. But I do remember seeing an early question, and this is an interesting one, is about in what language do you actually, or languages, do you actually put together your thoughts together, or in what language do you write most of the time? Would you like to answer that question? That's actually should be just a simple question, nothing to do with the philosophical debate of language as symbolic power.
Yeah, I've been raised at not code switching, so I don't code switch and I don't think switch. When I write in English, I am totally within the English, not only the English vocabulary and the English syntax, but the English frame of mind and frame of heart, I could say. When I write in French, and I love writing in French, I'm writing my memoirs right now in French, and I can only write them in French because I want the language to be consonant with my feelings and my emotional memories, and I can only do that in French. So yes, I mean, you become a little bit of a chameleon.
Switch on and off. Yes. Okay, so the last question I have is really looking forward. So you are the leading scholar, if I may say so, in the field of applied linguistics and language and culture. And you have won multiple awards for your publications and is widely recognized for your scholarship and contributions to the field. So I'm sure that many of the people here would like to know, what's your secret to your success?
There's no secret whatsoever. I've been extremely grateful and extremely lucky to have generous scholars who have supported me since I came to the US, who have supported me very generously. I mean, I remember Chris Candlin, Henry Widdowson, in Germany, Hans-Jürgen Krumm, in France, Daniel Kost, Geneviève Zarat, all these people from whom I have built on, coming from a French education in Germanic linguistics and literature. I had no linguistic background except philology at the time, and those people whom I got to know coming to the US, and it was in fact through the English language teaching that got off after World War II in the 70s and 80s, allowed me to hitch myself onto the movement of applied linguistics. And I just climbed on the shoulders of giants, as people would say. Yes, I have benefited from, after the World War II, of the whole thinking and philosophizing that went with English language teaching around the world. And it has opened my eyes then to the teaching of other languages, such as German and other living languages. But I must say, I have been very lucky coming to the US, of having 25 years at MIT, 25 years of active life at Berkeley, two prestigious universities who had fantastic students. And so I need to express my gratitude. I want to express my gratitude to all the incredible graduates and undergraduate students I had at those two universities. And of course, given that I'm not the youngest, I can say that I've had very good genes from my family, and I'm in good health despite the COVID-19, and I'm very grateful for that.
Oh, thank you. That's lovely to hear you say say your gratitude to your students and people who have worked with you. And I'm sure for those fortunate ones who have worked with you, they all say wonderful things about you, not only your energy, your ideas, and also looking back through your publications. It's amazing how much you have engaged with the latest debates and always actually push the front lines of the field, not just for the field of applied linguistics, but the language and understanding of connectivities between different disciplines.